The wind was a clawing thing, tearing across the bruised, darkening prairie sky. Alara pulled the thin shawl tighter around Martha's shoulders, the younger girls shivering uncontrollable. Beside them, the three littlest ones huddled against their mother's skirts, but mother was gone, and the skirts were just tatters clinging to Alara's own weary frame. 8 girls, ranging from Martha at 12 down to tiny, silent Sarah who was barely 4. They were lost. The wagon was shattered 2 days ago, their meager supplies dwindling faster than their hope. Now the storm was upon them, a monstrous wall of gray and green rolling from the horizon. Rain began to lash down, cold as ice slivers, instantly soaking through their threadbare clothes. The younger girls began to cry, thin, reedy wails swallowed almost instantly by the howl of the wind. Despair was a bitter taste in Alara's mouth. She scanned the featureless land, desperate for any sign of shelter, any break in the crushing emptiness, but there was nothing. Just the endless grass, the raging sky, and the terrifying knowledge of their isolation. It was then, a shape coalescing out of the swirling rain. A rider. On the prairie, a lone man could be salvation or a new kind of terror. Alara's hand instinctively went to the small, smooth stone she kept in her pocket, a futile weapon against a world that felt increasingly hostile. The rider drew closer, a dark silhouette against the storm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. His face, when he finally reined in his horse a short distance away, was grim, weathered, framed by a rough beard. He didn't dismount. His eyes, dark and assessing, swept over the group, the cluster of sodden, crying girls, the broken wagon, the palpable fear clinging to them like the rain. There was no immediate offer of help, no friendly greeting. Just that silent, intense gaze that seemed to look not just at them, but through them, and perhaps painfully at himself. Alara held her breath, gripping Martha's hand. She saw something in his eyes, something she couldn't name, not cruelty, perhaps, but a deep weariness, a self-contained isolation that felt as vast as the prairie itself. The cries of the younger girls seemed to reach him then, piercing through the storm's roar for just a moment. His jaw tightened. He glanced away, towards the northeast, his gaze fixed on something Alara couldn't see. When he looked back, there was a subtle shift, a flicker of something. Resignation, duty, pity. It was impossible to tell. He didn't speak for another long moment, the wind whipping the tails of his duster. Alara waited, every muscle tense. Survival instincts warred with ingrained caution. But the storm was worsening, and doing nothing meant certain death. Finally, his voice cut through the wind, rough and low. "Follow me," he said, and turned his horse. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was an instruction, delivered with a strange, almost reluctant finality. Alara hesitated for only a heartbeat. There was no other choice. "Martha, help the others," she murmured, her own voice barely a whisper. She took a deep breath, gathered the littlest ones close, and started walking, following the dark, retreating shape of the cowboy into the teeth of the storm. The shame she sensed emanating from him was a mystery, but his direction was, for now, their only hope. Following the cowboy was a brutal march. The ground became slick mud, sucking at their boots. The wind pushed against them relentlessly, tearing at their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Rain hammered down, blinding and relentless. The younger girls stumbled, their sobs turning to ragged gasps. Alara, burdened with Sarah and little Emmy clinging to her legs, felt her own strength draining away. Yet, the cowboy rode steadily ahead, never looking back, maintaining a distance that felt both protective and aloof. He moved with a quiet competence that Alara, despite her fear, began to observe. He seemed to know the land intimately, navigating unseen dips and treacherous patches of ground even through the obscured visibility. His horse, a sturdy bay, moved with equal assurance. There was no wasted movement in the rider, no unnecessary gesture. He simply led, a silent, unwavering guide in the chaos. Alara focused on his back, a dark, stoic shape, willing herself and her sisters to keep moving. Martha, pale but determined, helped the older girls, pulling them along, offering quiet words of encouragement that echoed Alara's own desperate hope. At one point, little Betsy, barely 5, fell hard, her cry sharp with pain and terror. Alara started towards her, but the cowboy reined in his horse, a sudden, unexpected stop. He dismounted fluidly, his movements quick and efficient despite his apparent weariness. Alara tensed, but he didn't approach her. Instead, he walked back to Betsy, knelt, and with surprising gentleness, checked her ankle. He didn't speak to the child, but his hands were careful as he helped her to her feet. He waited a moment, ensuring she could stand, then gave a short, almost imperceptible nod towards Alara before remounting and continuing on. He offered no explanation for his actions, no comforting words, just the quiet, necessary help. It was a small gesture, but it resonated deeply with Alara. It wasn't charity, not really. It felt more like a quiet acknowledgement of their shared predicament, a recognition of need that bypassed words. Her fear of him began to lessen, replaced by a grudging respect born of observation and necessity. After what felt like an eternity, a shape began to emerge from the driving rain, a low mound of earth, barely visible until they were close. It was a dugout, a simple structure built into the side of a small rise. It looked crude, almost primitive, but it offered the promise of shelter. The cowboy dismounted near a small corral fashioned from rough-hewn logs. He led his horse inside, a small, dark opening in the earth. He didn't beckon them, didn't speak. He simply disappeared inside. Alara hesitated, the instinct to be wary warring with the desperate need to escape the storm. But the younger girls were whimpering now, their little bodies shaking uncontrollably. The entrance to the dugout was a dark maw, but it smelled faintly of earth and wood smoke, promising warmth and dryness. With a final surge of resolve, Alara guided her sisters towards the opening, stepping into the darkness, the sound of the wind and rain immediately muted. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. A small, weak fire glowed in a crude fireplace at the far end. It was cramped, low-ceilinged, but it was dry. It was safe. The cowboy was already tending the fire, adding small pieces of wood. He still hadn't spoken, his back to them, a posture that suggested both industry and a profound reluctance to face them. His shame, Alara thought, seemed to precede him into this meager sanctuary. Inside the dugout, the silence was broken only by the crackling of the small fire and the soft, exhausted whimpers of the younger girls. Alara huddled with her sisters near the fire, spreading out their damp shawls in a futile attempt to dry them. The warmth was a blessed relief, seeping into their chilled bones. They were safe from the storm for now. The cowboy remained by the fire, his back mostly to them. He moved quietly, efficiently, adding wood, adjusting a pot hanging over the flames. Maybe coffee or just water. He didn't offer them anything, didn't ask their names, didn't explain why he had helped. His presence was heavy in the small space, a combination of quiet competence and a palpable, self-imposed distance. Alara watched him from beneath lowered lids. In the flickering firelight, his face, when she caught glimpses of it, looked etched with lines that weren't just from the sun and wind. There was a sadness there, a deep-seated regret that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. She thought about his silence, his reluctance. It wasn't unkindness. It was something else. Shame. He had helped them, saved them from the storm, yet he acted as if he had done something wrong. Why? What had he done to carry such a burden in his solitude? Alara had seen men weighed down by guilt before, men who had made choices they regretted. Her own father, in his way, had carried his own quiet sorrows. She understood, dimly, that shame was often a heavier burden than any external punishment. She wished she could understand his. It might explain the lonely set of his shoulders, the way he avoided their eyes. One of the younger girls, Lily, coughed, a harsh, rattling sound. Alara immediately went to her, rubbing her back. The cowboy paused in his task, his head tilting slightly, listening. He didn't turn around, didn't offer help, but his attention was there, a silent acknowledgement. After a moment, he reached for a small, battered tin near the fireplace. He opened it, took out a piece of something wrapped in cloth, dry jerky, Alara realized, and placed it silently on the ground a few feet from them. He didn't look at them as he did it. It was an offering, simple and necessary, given without expectation. Alara hesitated for a moment, then quietly took the jerky. She broke off small pieces and gave them to the girls. It was tough, but it was food, sustenance they desperately needed. The silence settled again, broken only by the storm outside and the soft sounds of the girls eating. Alara looked at the cowboy again. He was staring into the fire now, his expression unreadable. The storm raged, isolating them, forcing them into this strange, silent communion. He was their rescuer, yet he seemed burdened by the act. It was a puzzle Alara couldn't solve, but as she watched him, a different kind of understanding began to form. His value wasn't in words or explanations, but in actions. He had seen their need and met it, despite whatever internal struggle he carried. He was competent, quiet, and unexpectedly gentle when it mattered. The shame was his own to bear, but his help was real, a solid anchor in the midst of their crisis. And in that realization, Alara felt a fragile seed of resilience take root within her. They had survived the storm, guided by a man who carried his own internal weather. The storm broke before dawn. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the relentless drumming of rain softened to a whisper, then ceased entirely. A pale, watery light began to filter through the small opening of the dugout. Alara watched the light strengthen, a silent promise of the day. The girls were still asleep, huddled together, their breathing shallow but steady. The cowboy was already up, quietly tending his horse in the small corral area beside the dugout entrance. When he emerged, he walked outside without a word, seeming to assess the damage left by the storm. Alara woke the girls gently. They were stiff and cold, but dry. The fear of the storm had receded, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. Lost, alone, with their transport broken, they stepped out of the dugout into a transformed landscape. The prairie was churned mud, streaked with debris. The air was cold and damp, but fresh. Their broken wagon was visible in the distance, looking forlorn and utterly useless. The cowboy returned to the dugout entrance. He carried a canteen and offered it to Alara. "Water," he said, his voice still low and sparse. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy. It felt inadequate, a small word for the immense debt they owed him. He didn't respond, just nodded curtly. He didn't meet her eyes. He walked towards where their wagon lay. Alara followed him, the girls trailing behind her. He inspected the broken wheel, ran a hand over the splintered wood. He didn't offer to fix it. It was clearly beyond repair without proper tools and parts. He straightened up, scanning the horizon. "Settlement's 2 days' ride that way," he said, pointing a gloved finger to the southeast. "Stay by the creek bed. Water's scarce otherwise." His guidance was practical, direct. He wasn't offering escort, just information, the last piece of his reluctant aid. He turned then, walking back towards his horse. This was goodbye. Alara felt a strange mix of gratitude and a lingering curiosity about the man who had saved them yet seemed diminished by the act. "Thank you," she said again, louder this time, ensuring he heard her. He stopped, his back to her. He stood for a long moment, silent. Then, very slowly, he turned his head, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second. There was still that guardedness, the weariness, but beneath it, she saw something else, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even a hesitant acceptance of her gratitude. The shame was still there, a shadow in his eyes, but it seemed, just for a moment, less defining. He didn't speak. He simply turned back, mounted his horse, and rode away, disappearing across the muddy, storm-scarred prairie as quietly as he had appeared. Alara watched him go until he was just a speck against the vast sky. He had been a stranger, a rescuer burdened by his own past, who had nevertheless offered a lifeline in their darkest hour. He had shown them not grand heroism, but quiet competence and reluctant compassion. Alara turned to her sisters. They were still afraid, still vulnerable, but they were alive. They had faced the storm and survived. And in the heart of that survival, they had found unexpected help from a man ashamed of himself, proving that even the most burdened souls could offer light in the darkness. They would walk now, follow the creek bed, find the settlement. It would be hard, but they would do it. They had learned that resilience wasn't about having no fear, but about facing it. It was about finding shelter where you could, accepting help when it was offered, and putting one foot in front of the other, even when the path was long and uncertain. Alara took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the land. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds. They would make it.